This moment from Mission Impossible 7 was set up to be one of the coolest scenes in cinematic history. But when I saw Dead Reckoning in theaters on opening night, I couldn't help but be disappointed. Don't get me wrong, the movie was amazing, but the scene itself just felt smaller than it should have. And I think it all comes down to two major problems that persist throughout the entire movie. This and that. You see, the marketing for the latest Mission Impossible movie heavily touted that it was filmed for IMax, and therefore implied that an IMax theater was the best way to experience the epic blockbuster. However, Mission Impossible 7 never takes advantage of the IMax formatting. It just stays in CinemaScope for the entire runtime, which is wild because the previous installment in the franchise has some of the best IMax sequences to date. The Halo jump and the helicopter fight showcase how immersive and exhilarating an IMaX sequence can be, so it's mind-boggling that Tom Cruise, Christopher McQuarrie, and Eddie Hamilton decided to abandon the format one movie later. However, this problem isn't exclusive to Mission Impossible. Hollywood in its entirety seems to largely misunderstand the proper way to utilize aspect ratios. So let's look at some of the best and worst examples of film formatting, and just how dramatically two black bars can affect your story. In case you didn't know, an aspect ratio is a measurement of an image's width relative to its height. The most common aspect ratio as of right now is 16:9, as it fills out the entirety of modern televisions. It lends a contemporary and naturalistic feel to the story, since it's become the default way of presenting most episodic content. The second most common aspect ratio is 2.35:1, commonly referred to as CinemaScope. This format is how big budget Hollywood films are presented, and when projected in theaters, it's noticeably wider than 16:9. However, on digital displays, it's scaled down to fit a normal television, and that's why you get the black bars on the top and bottom. CinemaScope helps lend an epic scale to the story, being especially well suited for sweeping landscapes or intense action sequences. Certain films, like Tarantino's Hateful Eight, are shot in an even wider format, resulting in larger black bars, but the effect on storytelling is largely the same. Jumping back in time, 4:3 was the standard screen layout for CRT televisions, and as a result, this aspect ratio is commonly associated with older TV programs. If you play these shows on a modern display, you'll get an almost square image with black bars on the left and right. The use of 4:3 is heavily associated with nostalgia and the past, but it's also highly versatile when used in a modern context. The square frame spotlights the actors' faces better than any other aspect ratio, and the black bars give the content a theater-like quality that heightens suspension of disbelief. But what about IMaX? Well, that's where it gets complicated. True IMaX is displayed in an aspect ratio of 1.43:1, which is basically a super high-res version of 4:3 projected onto a 3-story tall movie screen. Then there's 1.9:1, which is a cropped version of IMaX used by most MCU movies. Using this screenshot from Batman v Superman, we can see how the presentation changes between standard movie theater screens, a digital IMaX screen, and a true IMaX projection. Things get a little more complicated when translating IMaX sequences to the small screen. If a particular movie shot its IMaX sequences in 1.9:1, it's easy to transition from the standard CinemaScope shots to the expanded aspect ratio without losing any of the image. But when a director like Christopher Nolan or Zack Snyder utilizes the full IMaX frame in their original shots, you're faced with a difficult choice. Nolan often settles on cropping down to 1.9, meaning that a small portion of the original image is actually missing on the home release, but the viewing experience is much smoother. Snyder, on the other hand, has consistently chosen to maintain the original image in its entirety, which is why the Snyder Cut looks like Malcolm in the Middle, and Batman v Superman has some of the most jarring scene transitions known to man. Now, whether it's at home or on the big screen, most films don't stay in the IMaX ratios for the whole movie. Shooting in IMaX is expensive, and the physical reality of the cameras cameras prevents them from being used in certain scenarios. So when should a movie utilize the big picture format? Well, like everything else in good cinema, it's all about enhancing the story. When the image on screen suddenly expands, it naturally draws more focus and adds an air of grandeur to whatever you're watching. So a good filmmaker will expand the aspect ratio whenever they want to add significance to a given moment. In The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan opens the film with the Joker's crew robbing a bank, and the entire sequence is shot in the expanded ratio. In addition to completely immersing the audience in the world of Gotham, the colossal imagery quite literally makes Joker a larger-than-life figure. Much like the Batman, seeing the Joker like this makes him feel like a supernatural or even mythic entity. IMax is also used for sequences like the armored car chase, the Hong Kong mission, and the hospital attack, clearly establishing that these scenes are meant to be major set pieces in the film. On the other side of the spectrum, a film like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is really inconsistent with when the IMax format is used. Don't get me wrong, when they do cut to the 1.91 aspect ratio, the imagery is stunning, but there's no meaning to it. We first expand to IMaX when everyone gets sucked into the quantum realm, and I initially thought this was brilliant. Using different aspect ratios to visually differentiate between the world our heroes are used to and the world our heroes are trapped in is a subtle but great bit of filmmaking. I figured it would be like The Hunger Games Catching Fire, which transitions to IMaX when Katniss enters the arena and does not switch back until she escapes. But unfortunately, Quantumania had other plans. After Scott saves Cassie, we cut over to Hope, and the film abruptly returns to CinemaScope. But why? What's different about Hope, Janet, and Hank? Are they less significant? Because when we cut back to Scott and Cassie, it's IMaX again. Except when they reach a new location, it's back to CinemaScope. So maybe IMaX is reserved for action sequences, but not for this action sequence. Do you see how inconsistent that feels? Aspect ratios are an incredibly important piece of cinema's vocabulary. Using them randomly or without purpose detracts from the overall meaning of a film. With more movies shooting in IMaX than ever before, the rampant misuse of this medium runs the risk of making it feel like a gimmick rather than a powerful tool. Filmmakers like Christopher Nolan and the Russo brothers show us just how grandiose the format can be. But if the approach to IMaX isn't replicated by the rest of Hollywood, we're in big trouble. It may just be some extra pixels, but if you really think that's all it is, you're missing the bigger picture. I'm Dylan, and this has been The Writer's Block.